And today we're going to be talking about our experiences with anxiety, how it holds other people back, how it's held us back in our experiences. And I guess I'll start by asking you, Leon, when have you, or how have you noticed that anxiety has held people back in general?
That's a really good question. All right, so first, let's define anxiety, right? So, anxiety is pretty much from a clinical perspective, it's the anticipation of fear, right? So, it's the anticipation of fear, or rather, the anticipation of danger, right? So, we're like, let's say fear is being afraid of the thing that's in front of you. So, like, let's say, I don't know, you're in front of some sort of, I don't want to use whatever, I'm going to say pit bull, even though people go, oh, why are you like, ragging on pit bulls? They're nice, like, creatures or whatever. So let's say you're in front of a like pit bull, right? The thing looks really vicious and you're like, oh my God, I'm really terrified, right? So that's fear. Anxiety is pretty much the anticipation of being in that particular situation or that, let's say, that kind of situation. So it's like the idea there is that I'm afraid of being in the sort of threatening situation, which I anticipate, kind of happening or coming. So with the anxiety, right? All of us have anxiety, right? So you and I have anxiety all the time. Every single person in the world has anxiety about God knows how many things, right? I could be afraid of going into work tomorrow. I could be afraid of having to see my boss. I could be afraid of, I don't know, God knows how many things, right? So when we're talking about anxiety, there's a huge distinction between an anxiety or like an anxiety episode, whatever, episodic anxiety, and then let's say what we call clinical anxiety, which is clinically significant, aka an anxiety disorder. So an anxiety
Mm.
disorder, right, is when we pretty much focus on anxiety persistently, right? It's persistent. It doesn't really make sense with the threat, right, or the anticipation of the threat, and it's something that's pretty much it's debilitating, right? It prevents you from maybe having friends. It prevents you from taking care of yourself. It prevents you from going to work or going to school, maybe even some combination of these things. So I just wanted to define that before answering your question. So what was your question again?
So, yeah, have you ever had experiences with anxiety holding you back? I guess let's start with that, and then I guess a little bit later we could get into maybe what you did to
Yeah.
overcome it to whatever extent. But
Okay,
yeah.
good question. So, anxiety holding me back, and just to be clear, I actually do have a number of anxiety disorders that I'm pretty much managing at this point. So, you
Mm.
got generalized anxiety, which is great, where you're constantly worried about a lot of different things that are really not necessarily threatening. Then you have a mild version of OCD, where I'm like obsessing about certain things, also connected to kind of generalized anxiety, where you're worrying. Fortunately for me, I don't have any particular rituals unless I'm in the particular episode. That then I'm like just constantly checking something over and over again. I
Mm.
don't know whether it's like health related stuff, and let's say I don't even know. What have I checked before that's health related? Oh, yeah. When I was waiting for the results of my blood test, and this is, oh my God. So, when I was waiting for the results of my blood test, I kept going on the website to check over and over again if they had arrived. So, that's usually pretty bad. So, I guess that would be considered like minor OCD because it's like with OCD, it's more persistent. With, let's say, well, I mean, it is OCD still, but the thing is, it's a minor version of it because in this case, I only do it periodically when something comes up, right? Or when I think something is coming up. Whereas with somebody who has like consistent chronic OCD, the idea is it's an everyday thing. Whereas like for me, I don't have like these repetitive checks every single day. Okay, so that's that. And then so yeah, so in terms of like actual anxiety, man, I could even say the podcast. Like, dude, I remember when we started it. I remember when we started it and thinking, like, oh my God, like, what is it that, like, why would people want to listen to us? And, we just had that conversation. So I was like, who the hell
Yeah.
cares about us, right? Who's going to listen to us? I was like, we're going to put ourselves out there. We're going to fucking embarrass ourselves. Literally, we're going to get like 2 hits or 2 views. People are going to be like, yeah, why are these like assholes on YouTube wasting other people's time? I was like, what am I going to look like on air, right? Like, what are people going to think about me? They'd be like, what the hell? Like, first of all, who is this person? And second of all, like, I'm like, are people even going to think like I'm attractive enough to be on fucking YouTube? As stupid as that sounds, right?
Okay.
So yeah, but it's mostly like, what do we have to offer? So in terms of like feeling anxiety and feeling super, I guess, worried, right? So going into the podcast, it's literally when we started and just wondering if the material that we're going to present, particularly me, right? I wasn't sorry, I wasn't really thinking about it from your end. So from my end, I was like, yeah, am I going to present material that's actually worth like speaking about or worth listening about? So yeah, so for me, in terms of just feeling anxiety, it's usually more it's performance, right? So my if I had to, I mean, it's hard to look at it in terms of like a core issue, but if I would say that there's a significant point of anxiety for me, it's performance anxiety. So I'm constantly worried that I'm going to like let people down and I'm not going to be able to perform up to, what I think is supposed to be my ability, or maybe not even ability, what I think other people's expectations are. And I'm like constantly worried that if I put myself out there, whatever it is that I do, right, it's just not going to be good enough. It's going to be like, a speaker being booed off a stage. So, yeah.
I find that interesting. Would you say that it was interesting also that bit earlier where you're like, oh, I didn't even consider like how you felt doing the podcast or something like that. Would you consider anxiety sort of a self-centered sort of mindset? Not, and by the way, no judgment. Anxiety is universal.
Yeah.
Again, like you said earlier, I have it, you have it, everybody has it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it is sort of self-centered. The attention goes all on you, like how you feel in this moment. You forget about the other person's or other people's experience, which is interesting actually. I wonder what being aware of that would do to anxiety in the moment. Do you think it would lessen it?
Yeah. So, what actually helped me? Interestingly, I don't think we ever had a conversation about this, but knowing that you were just as anxious as I was. Yeah, seriously.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, in the beginning, like when we had those conversations, and you know how like you have a persistent cough before our sessions, and I mean sessions, sorry, wrong field, before our shows.
You're not supposed to tell them about this. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so like how whenever you feel anxious, I'm like, oh, cool. So I'm not like the only one who's anxious, especially when we have guests. I think I told you. I mean, we talked about this, right? We're like literally after every show that we have guests, yo, my stomach is always churning after that episode. I'm like, yo, I have to go home. I don't even want to like most of the time do anything.
Oh, really?
Yeah, man.
I didn't know about that part.
Yeah.
Afterwards.
What's so interesting to me, yeah. It's like because in the beginning, right, I feel like in some way I can manage the anxiety and I don't necessarily process it. Like I feel it's weird. It's hard to even explain. So I feel it, but I don't feel it, right? I guess this is what they call compartmentalization in like psychoanalytic theory, where the idea is like your mind sort of splits off. But here's the thing, my body detects all of it. So what happens is after the show is done and we're like, yeah, we're on that emotional high. I'm like, oh my God, man, why is my stomach hurting me all of a sudden?
That's interesting. Yeah. For me, so I'm not, I have not been examined, so I'm not really sure what kind of anxiety disorders I have. I wouldn't be able to tell you that exactly. Mm-hmm. But as far as, like the show is concerned, since we brought that up, when we first, I mean, here's the thing. I have simultaneous perspectives running at the same time. And it's like they're all trying to manage each other, for a lack of a better way of articulating that. So like, for instance, let's say it's before we start a show, we have a guest coming. Mm-hmm. And let's say this is earlier in the show's history, right? So, and I like that we could say that now, the show is history. Mm-hmm. But and you've seen it too, before an episode, I would start to get like extremely nervous about how the performance was going to go. And I realized that, it's like a form of performance anxiety, right? You don't know how it's going to go. You want to make a good impression on the guest. You also want to make sure that like you perform at your best. So this way you communicate certain ideas clearly, succinctly. And I suppose it probably stems from some sort of a core belief where maybe I think, well, it's fine because I manage it, right? Mm-hmm. So again, there's simultaneous perspectives going on, but I bet you there's this core belief going on of like, oh, I am not enough.
Of course.
Right? As if, something has to be done, or I have to, something about how I am needs to be modified in order for this to go perfectly. Right. So that's why I keep running that sort of anxious narrative, right? So this way it sort of leverages me in a weird way of putting it, because I know I'm going to do this no matter what. Right. So, which is also another perspective that's going on. Like, I'm sure there are people who, again, it's that fight or flight mechanism, right? If you're too scared, right, you're not going to actually end up taking the action, right? It's kind of like if you're too anxious to go to school or something like that for whatever reason, maybe you don't want to be judged by other people. Maybe, you are afraid of how you'll do in class. So you are, by knowing that you didn't even go or attempt, you're not even proving to yourself that it was based on your merit that you failed. You're just like guaranteeing it because you didn't go. And there's a weird safety in that. I have some experience with that. But back to the show, right? So deciding to take the action, I mean, is in a way overcoming that anxiety, right? In a way, you still feel it, but I mean, I don't know. Would you say that it's? I mean, it's okay to feel anxiety, right? I even sense as I'm talking about this right now that I'm like, there's a pride thing that doesn't want to allow me to express that, I feel anxiety sometimes or whatever, especially the nature of our show. A lot of times we talk about being present and things like that. And sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, you know what's so interesting? So I don't remember who said this. This was one of Scott's guests on the psychology podcast. I don't remember who the person was, which fucking sucks because this is like a good source of information here. But so he said that, and here I'm going to tell you why I disagree with him. Not necessarily. I like his idea. I don't necessarily agree with it. So he says that actually you don't need any anxiety. And he said for the person who's like, who has like the optimal performance is actually in a pure flow state. And he says, when you look at the flow state, right, there's actually no anxiety there. So he's like, you don't actually want anxiety for optimal performance. So I don't disagree with him about that. Let me just be clear. Like, that's great, right? And I agree. Sure. When you're in a flow state, I'm sure you're probably performing optimally.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
How many people get into that flow state, right? So why I like with your version of anxiety is that because essentially what you're saying is that, okay, let's say I can't get into this flow state, right? Let's say I'm so fucking anxious that the best that I could do is sort of work with my anxiety and live with it, which is, I think, the vast majority of people, definitely with anxiety disorders, and even just people with anxiety, like with performance anxiety, up until a point, right? I'm sure you can get to a point where you're in a flow state. So my thing is, like, if you use pride and you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to feel courageous after doing this, and I'm going to be proud of myself for putting myself out there, you can use that as a motivator to say, like, here's this thing that I'm doing that's going to scare me because I clearly can't just shut it off, but I'm going to be able to feel proud of myself for doing it. I think flow state probably happens like after you've done it a certain amount of times, and then you're like, okay, like, wow, this is something I really love, and I don't feel anxious about it because I've done it so many times. What?
Well, to tag that, so all the anxiety that I feel is always pre-performance. Like, there's always, whenever there's an expectation set of how reality is going to be, right? Which, again, I also have a simultaneous narrative running where I'm like, you can't predict how reality is going to be, right? There's no way you're going to know what the next second will bring. You think that maybe before you start, like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I don't know what's happening, how this is going to work.
Right.
But you have to have a sort of simultaneous sort of faith that once you start, the words come, right? Yeah. The ideas come. You're also having an abstract concept of like how a conversation is going to go is a strange idea because a conversation is dynamic in nature, right? You may bring up a question, right? That all of a sudden, that's where my recall comes in. And then all of a sudden, that's where content becomes produced. Right. But in that pre-performance phase where I start to imagine how this is going to go, there's no way you could take into account all of the variables that are going to be present during the conversation. Right. So it's like such a faulty way of trying to predict that kind of performance, for example, right? Yeah. So that helps me to reduce the anxiety pre-performance, right? So it's not this all-encompassing, overwhelming thing, right? And then once we actually get started, this is why I wanted to tag what you just said a moment ago. Yeah, and then I get into a flow state. Then I'm actually paying attention. I'm not nervous in the middle of the conversation because everything's already started, right? Then afterwards, that's interesting that you mentioned earlier that like sometimes you'll think about how the episode's going to perform and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I wonder what's up with me. Actually, that one I don't think about. To some degree, I do, but there's a point when I realize like there's so much that's out of my control.
Yeah.
So maybe that simultaneous narrative sort of running really reduces that anxiety, right? If I had to discuss like another personal experience with anxiety, though, related to the show, especially, it's like, um, e- I guess before we even started the show, I was worried about how I would come off. Right?
Mhm.
Would I be able to express these ideas I've had in my head for a long time in a way that's relatable to people? Right? You start to ask, is this just something that I intuitively get? But
Mhm.
when the words come out and this is articulated, will it come out the way that I intend it to?
Right.
Right? And I think this is something that a lot of speakers or public speakers struggle with, right? But the ones who are really good, um, yeah, they're incredible. So that's the thing. I would sort of compare myself to these people, right? And then that sort of made me judge myself harshly, and then not even want to take action in the first place.
Mhm.
But I realized that you had to sort of be willing to either endure humiliation or willing to fail, right?
Yeah.
In order to eventually get better, right? You have to
Yeah.
sort of allow people to see you not be at your best, right?
Yeah.
And that might not even be the case, actually. That's just like something you should kind of go in with
Mhm.
in order to attempt to take the action that you're so afraid to take,
Yeah.
right? But a lot of times it ends up being better than you think it is.
Yeah.
A lot of times the feedback that you get is a lot better than you think it is.
Mhm.
And then
It might,
even if it's
yeah, it might
sorry,
not
go
be
ahead.
yeah, it might not be perfect, but it's like much better than what you were thinking or what your interpretation of it was. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that's the thing. I just feel like so anxiety, I feel like is something that is very manageable
Mhm.
depending on several factors. One of them one of them is being, what narrative or narratives do you have running in your mind, I suppose, um, while feeling anxiety or when you think about your own anxiety. At the same time, I'm sure there are other techniques as well. I mean, some people will, change their body language. Maybe maybe you'll notice that sometimes when you're feeling anxious or you're feeling like you're forgive this phrasing, but you're energetically tight,
Mhm.
right? You may
Mhm.
notice that your body language reflects that,
Right.
and there's this sort of feedback between like how you feel in the kinesthetic mode, and then how you feel in the vocal,
Right.
facial,
Well,
emotional
and
mode.
how you present yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
So I noticed that, yeah, if for example, let's say I'm tight, like
Mhm.
my shoulder, I'm leaning forward, right? And my shoulders are tight. And there's this moment of, like, I'm just not feeling, I could tell like there's anxiety or I'm not fully relaxed.
Right.
Then, yeah, I would just as simply as just like putting my shoulders back, maybe moving around a little bit,
Mhm.
maybe, relax my breathing or something like that,
Mhm.
slow down, and then all of a sudden my state, if you will, changes.
Yeah.
That's another way. I don't know what's your experience with managing anxiety. Is it cognitively based
Mhm.
mainly?
Yeah, mainly. Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. So
yeah.
like when we're like, let's say if we're talking about the show, right? I try to remind, and again, like this is why I'm against. Okay, I mean that's maybe too extreme. Not against the idea of like flow being the optimal, sort of state, right, in terms of performance. But why? Let's say I don't think I'll ever reach it. So what happens with me is like, let's say when we have a guest on, and let's say with cognitively reframing or just rethinking things, and just sort of seeing the world a little bit more objectively, what I remind myself is that, okay, here are all of these other times that our interviews went fairly well and everything was okay, right? So does that necessarily mean that I'm not anxious going into the interview or I'm not anxious during the interview? No, obviously. So, but what it does mean is that I'm able to kind of put myself out there and still do it anyway. But for me, the cognitive part is the most important. Again, not because it like eliminates the anxiety or anything like that, but it just makes it much more tolerable. Whereas before, maybe it would feel overwhelming. But I think the hardest part, and I think you would agree here too, is that like to actually put yourself out there. So it's that initial step, right? It's to say like, hey, you know what? We're going to do this thing and we're going to try it for the first time. And like, we're going to see what happens if we epically fail or not. So honestly, man, I even wonder how we got ourselves to do the podcast initially too. Because you know what? I think I just kind of said it, like I said it as a like an idea or something. I think I had this conversation with Vegas, and I was like, "Oh, hey man, like, what do you think if I just like do videos for like the overall platform and do like YouTube stuff on mental health?" He's like, "Oh yeah, no, sounds good." And then I'm like, "Oh, maybe this could be like a podcast." And then I'm thinking about you, right? And I'm like, maybe I should do a podcast with Alan. But by the way, this whole time that I'm thinking of these things, I'm actually not that serious about it. I'm just like, "Oh, these sound like interesting ideas. Let's just see what happens," right? I could say I tried. But then after we finally got to the point where it feels like now there's no turning back, I feel like that was also a thing that pushed me too. So it's, yes, the cognitive reframing in one sense, right, somewhere down the line. But initially, I think once you build up like some expectation, we didn't have obviously a big expectation. We weren't expecting like thousands of viewers, but there was the expectation that, hey, you got me into this. Now you have to actually follow through, right? Because when I got you into it, I'm like, shit, now I have to follow through. I can't just be like, oh, you know what, forget it. I give up. Or I'd tell Vegas and be like, hey, sorry, man. So you know what? I honestly think it's that fear of disappointment for me, that initially gets me over the hurdle. So at first, it's definitely the desire, the drive to, create something. But honestly, man, after a while, I'm like, wait, shit, what the fuck did I just get myself into? I really don't want to do this. But it's that fear of disappointing the people that I've pretty much, what's the word? I got them, I kind of enveloped them into my scheme, right? And now I'm like, oh shit, I can't let these guys down. I just wasted everybody's time then.
You know what's great about that? It's fantastic about that. It was exactly the same for me, the disappointment thing.
Yeah.
So by myself, I was doing ego ends now before, right? But nothing was essentially being done, so to speak. Like here's the thing. I always had an idea that I wanted to relate to people, ideas about critical thinking, nuance, what is the ego, what is identifying with beliefs, what tribalism, how to sort of run simultaneous perspectives, not be attached to one,
right.
Seeing the other as yourself, all of these kinds of concepts, right? Always wanted that to be related. Well, not always, but for a while before we met. Okay. But then I never got to the point where I could see the structure of how to do that, right? I knew about podcasts. I'd listened to podcasts. What I was thinking what it was going to be originally was create video clips, either like me just like in front of this camera or in front of a camera, and then relating something about in a 10-minute video, 15-minute video, 30-minute video, whatever, certain concepts, and structuring out a certain way and explaining what do these things mean and trying to be engaging and all of that. But I never sort of got the structure down. So because I never had that structure down of how this was going to work, I didn't begin. I didn't start the process of making those videos and things like that. But then when you had brought up the idea of doing a podcast, I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. Because one, you don't have to have prepared material, right? Or in a sense you do, because it's all the material that you take in, that you studied.
Oh,
and then it comes out in conversation.
You have to know your shit. Yeah. You don't have to prepare per se, but if you come on and you say some shit that's wrong, like, I mean, we haven't had this fortune because I don't think we have that many viewers, but people call you out on it. Like, you've seen what happens to Rogan and all these other people. It's fucking terrible.
Right. And also, we're also very careful about when we say certain things that aren't verified. We'll be like, well, actually, some people say this, some people say that, being general. But anyway, so the moment you did that, I was like, oh, yeah, we could sort of riff, right? And have certain ideas come up. And okay, yeah, a structure, finally, right? The only step was take the action, right? Because I had been so used to not doing that, right? That I had really cemented in my own life, like proof as like a reference experience. Like Alan does not take action. Like he didn't follow through on like this dream that he had. This is what I was thinking. I never said this before, but okay. But yeah, then when that opportunity presented itself, yeah, I was scared. But then at the same time, it's like, I was like, oh, okay, well, Leon's willing to do this with me. Awesome. We don't know where it's going to go. Hey, at least we're trying, right? The fact that we were attempting something like that, it felt like a win. Like back to that winner effect thing. You start to you start to for me, in my framework, in my belief system, even taking that kind of action, whether it was successful or not, was considered a big deal for me, because it was, as opposed to not taking any action at all.
Yeah,
right?
and it went against that core belief of Alen doesn't pursue his dreams.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, and also I didn't want to disappoint. And I love that I had that leverage. I love it because I was like, oh yes, okay, finally, I'm going to be doing this. Okay, cool. And then it became, we're doing this. And then it became like it started to evolve into something different from there. But yeah, in the beginning, I was also afraid, how are we going to come off? How do we have the perfect camera equipment? Do we have the perfect mic equipment? Oh, even, it's funny, if we looked at what we were working with before now, like we should revisit that someday. We'll be like, oh my God, why did we think that was okay to do? Right.
Yeah.
But we have to start somewhere.
And what about also the fact that we were like nobodies, right? So it's not like, let's say, I don't know who, okay, let's say, whatever, I'll just mention Nikki Glazier. I like her a lot. I like her podcast, right? It's really cool and just interesting and fun. So for Nikki Glazier, right? So she's somebody, right? So she was like this like popular comedian. And then one day she's like, hey, I'm going to go start a podcast here to my fans. Let me put out, some fucking like Instagram post. Listen to my podcast, right? So instantly, bam, she's like, I have viewers, right? We were not that. Like, who the hell were we? So I'm like, great. We're like these fucking two schlubs who are starting from scratch, who have like no real foundation, no fan base. We have no, like, we're not in movies. We're obviously not comedians, right? We haven't been on anybody's show or anything like that. So, I mean, we hope that we have something to offer. We think we do. But at the end of the day, we don't have like a following. Whereas like, a comedian or whomever could just say, hey, you know what? I want to start a podcast. Cool. Now you have a podcast and like thousands of, probably, well, for her, it's millions, I think. But like, let's say for their average comedian, probably thousands of listeners, right? So for me, I think hopefully, and I mean, not hopefully, I guess I could allow myself to feel pride in that. I think it's pretty cool that we did that despite the fact that we didn't have a following and we were completely nobody at the time. So
I agree with that. Right. Yeah, that was definitely a thought in my head as well. I was like, okay, who are we? Anyone who did start their podcast already had some kind of platform to work with.
Yeah.
Even Rogan, when he started, and like for him, the biggest thing for a long time, and this was not in the start of it, the very start of it, he didn't have like anybody really watching. It was like 100 people, 200 people tops.
Yeah.
Then when it started to even do okay by my standards, because I actually started listening to Rogan from the very beginning. So
2010?
Was it 2010?
Yeah.
I think it was before that. No,
2010. So I'm assuming you listened to those first podcasts, like with like Jan Irvin, and I forgot who the other person was.
I think it was before. I really think it was before, because I remember being in high school.
No. Last year was his 10th anniversary. 10 year.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
So
you might have heard him like do stuff like shows or whatever, maybe some other stuff, but it wasn't like the Joe Rogan experience.
So I listened to him originally on the Opie and Anthony show.
Yeah.
Right. So he had somewhat of a platform already. He did also had Fear Factor,
right,
and these other things. So even though that didn't help him initially with the podcast, because podcasting was a new thing at the time, for me it was a big deal when I saw him having 2,000 people live watching him. I was like, oh, he's getting really a lot of people at the same time watching this. This is going to be a big thing, I think, right? And I guess compared to network TV, that's not a big deal at all at the time. But I was never used to seeing anybody who was live getting that many people simultaneously watching. I remember 100, 700 was like a big deal on YouTube Live or whatever the thing was at the time. He was using Vimeo. Okay, what's the point though? These people went from a platform that they already kind of had, and then attempted podcasting, and then somebody like a Nikki Glazer. Yeah, I mean, if you post on your Twitter where already you have all your followers from your comedy career, I'm having I have a podcast, check this out, all of that. Yeah, you're going to be able to amass an audience much quicker.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that we were nobodies.
Interesting. So, wow. Okay. So I want to ask why, but I just want to interject really quickly and say I think because of black and white thinking and just the way human beings are, I think it's very easy for, like, let's say us to say, okay, well, you know what? We're not her, or we're not like Rogan or whatever. And if we're going to obviously compare ourselves to him, I mean, it's not even close. So the idea there is like, here's the thing. Let me just preface this quickly by saying, like, look, anxiety most of the time is super irrational, right? So I understand what I'm about to say is super rational. So when I would come in with it, right, or like when I would think about it in terms of my perfectionism, I would think like, oh my God, like look at how we're doing as compared to these people, right? So that would make me fucking anxious. And I'm like, this is like embarrassing, right? We're not anywhere close to the numbers that they're pulling in. Like, this is awful, right? And the anxiety was like, you should stop doing this because you're like failing, right? And you're going to continue to fail, and you're going to continue to look stupid because you guys aren't doing anything worthy, based on, these comparisons, right? That's black and white thinking, right? So yeah, can you follow up on what you just said? That's actually really interesting. Why do you feel like you're actually proud of it?
Well, I feel like, again, it felt like a win.
Yeah,
It felt
to
like
get through that anxiety. Yeah.
yeah, it felt like a win against that anxiety, because that anxiety is so people live with anxiety every day, and there's some people who it's incredibly crippling for,
Right.
right? And to the extent that you're willing to take action outside of your existing belief set or current view of reality is the extent to which you overcome that anxiety and then start to be able to relax a bit more and have a happier sort of life, if that's sort of your aim. I suppose it depends whose values are we considering, right?
Right. Yeah.
But for me, that was a big deal, right? To be able to be like, okay, just try, what is it that you really want? Like, I asked myself, I've all those self-help books where they tell you, write down your purpose. Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about your current life circumstances? What would you need to do to get to the future result that you know? And so upon doing things like that, I had sussed out what it is that I really wanted my purpose to be. That was actually that's another conversation, actually, for how to even come up with what you want your purpose to be. That took years to even figure out.
Mm-hmm.
But once I had realized, okay, if I asked myself, what do I truly want to do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is, I would like to relate these ideas that I had understood or think I understood. Let's be fair.
But that were helpful, right?
That were helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I want, and that to me was above, like, the highest. How do I put this? It trumped my anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
right? And even then, even having that higher purpose, so to speak, it wasn't enough. It was enough to create certain boundaries against defeating thoughts.
Right.
So that was good. It did work its magic in that sense. But the taking action portion, that was, again, a huge win against anxiety.
Right.
And I feel like us not being anyone in particular, it felt like even a bigger win against anxiety, because anxiety wants to, or your mind wants to rationalize, yeah, don't do this,
It's
right?
escape, right?
And but there's something you kind of get as you kind of get older, which is like acting in spite of those rationalizations
Mm-hmm.
works so counterintuitively in your favor a lot of the time.
Yeah.
See, they're there to protect you, right? For survival. We talked about this a little bit. I don't know if it was last week.
Mm-hmm.
Not last week, last episode.
Right.
I feel like a lot of times, yeah, okay, fire is bad, right? Don't put your hand in the fire. Okay, there's a lot of things that you have fears against, or that you rationalize for your survival, right?
Right.
But there is these other things that just kind of feel like you're rationalizing for survival, but that's not the case. It's just survival of a concept of who you think yourself to be,
Yeah.
right? But that's not the way to. It feels like when you transcend that,
Mm-hmm.
then you start to add more of a depth to your character. You add more like a sort of a novel sense of life. You
Mm-hmm.
start to feel better about things, and it also gives you a sort of hope that you could continue to do that, right? And transcend that former self that was so crippled by anxiety,
Yeah, and who
right?
needed so badly to see him or herself in such a positive light, like in a too positive light.
Yeah, I mean, there were, for example, there's other, like, for example, seeking a partner,
Hmm.
right? You maintain your confidence by not approaching anyone or
Hmm.
talking to anyone.
Hmm.
You can still maintain whatever narrative you want of yourself,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Oh, you know what I used to do? I want to know what you think about this. So this is so embarrassing to say now. Fortunately, I don't do this anymore. I've grown out of it. But you know, like that idea of rejecting people before they reject you.
Yeah.
Speaking of partners, that's what I used to do. So, like when I would go into a room or a party or whatever, I'd make it seem like I didn't give a shit about anybody there, right? And people would be like, "Oh wow, like that guy's an asshole." I'm like, "Yeah, well, I am, right? I don't give a shit about any of you." So what I
Yeah.
would do is I would purposely be standoffish, maybe not even purposely. After a while, it became kind of like automatic, where I would be standoffish just to be able to tell myself, like, "Yeah, who cares? Like, I'm this, of course, this person didn't like me. Like, I was a dick to them, right?" It's sort of like the idea of tanking, right? If you kind of throw a game, right, then you can tell yourself, "Oh, well, it's not that I lost, right? Or it's not that I lost because I wasn't good enough or I wasn't valuable enough or whatever, right? It's I lost because I didn't care, right?" That's the same thing that I used to do too. So I don't know if I necessarily was that psychologically minded, where I would say, "Well, no, 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 I made this happen. Like, this person didn't like me because I was an asshole." I would just say to myself, "Yeah, who cares? Like, they didn't like me because I didn't give a shit about them. Oh well."
Yeah, and there's a security in that,
Yes.
right? There's a
Yep.
there's a security in knowing that, this is the action that I took, and I knew what result that action would bring, as opposed to the randomness or the chaos of um, actually trying to connect, maybe being rejected, maybe not being
Likely, I would
rejected.
say even likely being rejected, because most people get rejected. And it's like for me, in some way, I was like, "Oh, I'm above that. I don't have to experience rejection."
Well, actually, it depends on what level of rejection. I mean, even I realize if, I mean, it really depends how you come off. I mean, I guess here's the thing, if you come up with nervous energy,
Hmm.
yeah, you may get negatively rejected because the other person doesn't know that you're being nervous. It's just something that sort of pollutes your speech,
Hmm.
and it sucks because a lot of people, when they're trying for the first time to try
Hmm.
to talk to other people,
Hmm.
forget even just like a partner or whatever, just
Right,
like in
right.
general, just try to talk to other people and socialize and all that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it can be difficult. Like, for example, you may get negative, you may get here. I feel like it depends. Like if you're honestly trying, in your demeanor, people might just be nice to you,
Hmm.
and it's like you may not befriend them, or it may not go somewhere,
Right.
but they'll at least be nice to you.
Hmm.
Sometimes it really depends in the approach. You may get rejected, but it's not like that crazy sense of
Right, right.
rejection that people project that they're gonna
Yes,
get.
yes. And
Like,
by the way,
you're
it's a
nothing.
yeah, but by the way, that's also based in childhood too, man. Because when you were a kid, that's the way you were rejected most of the time. That's what really sucks. It's like that stuff kind of sticks with you, right? So it's like if you're trying to make friends, right? A lot of times those kids are just like fucking honest with you, and they'll be like, "Yo, dude, like you suck. I don't want anything to do with you." Obviously, as an adult, it's not like that. It's just like those imprints are still there.
Yeah, but then, yeah, that's true. That's true. But I guess once you kind of get an idea of how things work in terms of
Well, you
like,
accept it, I think. You know, you have to accept it. Like you really believe, like, okay, like this isn't gonna happen in this way again.
yeah, I think that's a big part of it. At the same time, I feel like, I mean, some people come to this naturally. Most people come to this naturally, but you start to kind of get a sense of the dynamics of conversation, like
Mhm.
a little bit of empathy here and there. You may be wondering, how the other person is feeling. That may determine how you approach them.
Mhm.
Then when they sense that you kind of get a sense of how they feel, they kind of let you build rapport with them.
Right.
So but and then, yeah, if you had a whole bunch of experiences that gave you negative references, that's going to be
Sometimes, by the way, you don't even need to have a whole bunch because of the way the brain works, right? You recall all of the negative experiences much quicker than the good ones. So what happens is even if you have like a handful of them as a kid, you're kind of fucked for a long time until you see a therapist and hopefully have supportive family members.
I would say this, as hope for any listener who may be getting some value out of this, I was a hard case in terms of socializing
Yeah.
with other people. I really was a hermit. I would stay in, actually. And by the way, I love video games. To this day, I love video games. Nothing wrong with video games. Or I'm sure you could find something wrong with it. But
Yes, inherently, there's nothing wrong with video games.
But
They can be misused. Yeah.
sure. But but yeah, I took solace in video games, solace in TV shows, movies, and all of that. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently.
Right.
But what I would say is I found safety and security in them and just wouldn't try to relate to other people. I would sort of fantasize or because I'm living in these other worlds, right? Through movies and such. That was me getting some kind of slice of life or a slice of experience.
Right.
And yeah, by the time it came to me, attempting to even try to talk to other people, it was hard. It was really hard.
No, yeah.
Even to my own friends, even to people who I had grown up with, there were phases I would go through where I had completely lost the ability to socialize, or I didn't want to go out as much.
Yep.
And I'd be like, yeah, it was definitely rough. And then the experience of then trying to talk to people was, how should I put this? I mean, I had to take what I could get. Like, I had to take on a mindset of anytime I talk to one person in the day or something like that, or talk for more than a minute, I had to take wins like that. That like, as soon as I learned about things like winner effect,
Yes.
I had to take you could see the way I'm trying to even recall this, it's so fragmented because it's like trying to recall a broken
interesting
memory. Yeah,
and it's also far away or further away.
That's nice. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah,
you're not that person. You weren't even that person when I met you, so
no, that's true.
And we met a while ago, so it's not like, so that's interesting. What are we talking about here? Like your teenage years, early 20s, probably?
Early 20s, teenage years. Yeah. But again, it's that survival instinct, right? You don't want to violate that idea of who you think you are, or you don't want to feel fear from doing the unknown.
Yeah, and sometimes people don't want it confirmed. Like they already have like these negative core beliefs. Let's say you're aware of them, right? You're not like let's say narcissistic in the sense of you're not covering it up, right? There's no like sort of seesaw where one day you're feeling like the greatest, the next day you're feeling like the worst, right? So you're not sort of overcompensating. So for people who already do consistently feel negatively about themselves, most people don't want that confirmed, right? It's like you don't want to put yourself out there. That's what it was with me, by the way, when I would like not put myself out there, when I would let's say talk to girls or just go to a party or whatever, right? Because I didn't want it confirmed that I was unlikable, I would reject them, right? I'd be like, yeah, like, oh, of course they didn't like me. Again, like I didn't give a shit. So what's there to really like, right? I didn't really put in any effort. They saw that I didn't put in any effort. I might have even said some like offhanded comment that they didn't like, and they're like, oh, what a dick. And I'm like, yeah, sure, cool, I could live with that. I can accept not being liked for being an asshole. It's much harder not being liked when you're actually trying and put yourself out there.
Yeah, I mean, I had my own version of that. Yeah, I would also, I've rejected people too out of just sheer nervousness. But I've also allowed conversations to get to a certain level of rapport, but then completely step back.
Interesting. Why'd you do that?
Because then I started getting into unknown territory.
Yeah, there you go, right? It's like you're comfortable and safe, but then you get to like, what is that point of no return? And you're like, oh shit, how did I get here?
Yeah, I mean, it was something. It was better than nothing.
It was. This is so interesting. Like, can you tell me what happens? So like, okay, so you get to this point, right? You're like, okay, conversation's going well. This person seems to really like me. I like them. And then like, what's that breaking point?
It's like the point when you make your intentions known. So for example, say it's I love how much we talk about girls in this show. It's hilarious,
Well,
actually.
yeah,
But
I
whatever.
mean, we're
But that
heterosexual
whatever.
men and who would like to date. So, you know.
So yeah. But yeah, when it came to that, um, I was so enamored by the idea of learning charisma,
Mhm.
being able to have these like energetic back and forths, get her, she's interested, I'm interested, this is fantastic, we're all having a fun time, awesome, right?
Mhm.
And then there's this point when I would get into a territory where it's like, it's time to sort of show your intent. Like
Mhm.
I want to take this somewhere, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's for some reason in my mind, I had this thing where anytime I would get to that point, that we're entering a territory where I'm like, oh, now I can be rejected. There's no safety in like doing these things that definitely amp up the energy, and like I learned that aspect of it. It's weird. It's like sometimes you look for like whatever is the magic pill
Right.
in
Right.
terms of like what could solve your situation,
Mhm.
and you learn all these little uh I mean, a lot of this stuff is natural. uh you internalize these like tactics, like body language,
Yeah.
like you know you notice I do this thing where I move my hands a lot when I talk.
Mhm.
Some people like it, some people don't, but I'll
I
tell
mean,
you this.
some of the gestures that you make are just hilarious.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
hilarious. It's like it's engaging, right?
Yeah.
Um, you know, eye contact,
Right.
these things,
Mhm.
And so there was safety in knowing what the established method was for getting something going.
Right.
But then there were areas where it's like, even if I read about this is not the exact one-to-one situation
Mhm.
of what's happening in front of me right now.
Right.
And then it starts to become this like shaky thing
Mhm.
where all of a sudden I have to make a choice. And I realize, but again, counterintuitively, like, so a lot of times what I would do is actually I pulled back, and that was me giving into the anxiety.
Right.
But anytime I went past that, I had the best time. I
Mhm.
had the best time. I was so happy. I took action. There's a sense of pride, like you're happy with yourself. You've
Mhm.
also sort of expanded your character because you've added another reference of you doing something in spite of the feeling that's telling you not to do it,
Right.
right? And yeah, it hasn't happened as, again, this is an everyday thing. uh every day there's that managing of the, I mean, look, it's funny when I say managing of the anxiety. Here's the thing: if I was a listener and I was listening, I was hearing somebody say talk like that,
Mhm.
I would think they're saying like, oh, they struggle with anxiety, and then there's like they would have this association with anxiety being this crippling thing.
Mhm.
It could be, but when I use it in this context here, like if let's say it's every day, it's a management of your anxiety or
Mhm.
my anxiety,
Mhm.
I would just say it's a management of those rationalizations that keep me from doing the best I possibly could that day.
Right.
And then I'm always reviewing, being present, not allowing myself to have anxious thoughts about the future or reliving the past, right?
Mhm.
There's these certain ideas that it's not like once you learn them, that's it. I mean,
Mhm.
sometimes it works like that. It depends on the person.
It's
You can
rare. I think
internalize.
it's very rare. Beliefs are so hard to change. So hard.
Yeah, so I feel like it's an everyday practice to overcome these aspects of ourselves.
Yeah.
So I have overcome them, but I need to keep overcoming
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
in order
Mhm.
to win, so to speak. It's not about winning,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, and I think I like what you're saying because even clinically speaking, right, the people who do have anxiety disorders, right? So it's like because there's something called like an anxious temperament. So look, some people are just like more anxious than others naturally, right? So what that means is that they need support, right? They need their own kind of tools to use when the support is unavailable. Sometimes they don't even want the support, they just want to use their own tools, which is great. But the point is that even if you don't meet the criteria, let's say if you're somebody who was once diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, let's say, well, there's something called like unspecified anxiety disorder, which is a little bit more situational, where like, let's say, you get fired or whatever. Now you're like, oh my God, I'm constantly worried about my job, right? So that's a little bit different, right? So so the thing is like, there's a predisposition for it, obviously. So, but the point is that your threshold for anxiety doesn't necessarily mean that you have an anxious temperament, right? When I say anxious temperament, meaning that when you were like an infant, right, when you were a little kid, you were super anxious already. A person who just is situationally anxious is probably like, let's say if they get a new job, chances are they're not going to be as anxious, right? I'm just saying for this particular diagnosis, right? Because you can also have a generalized anxiety disorder, but then have situational anxiety on top of that too, right? Where it's like you're worried about a lot of things, and hey, one of those things is the fact that you're out of one. So yeah, so okay. So besides that, the idea here is that like for a person with an anxiety disorder initially, right, and somebody who let's say had the anxious temperament as a kid, even if you're not diagnosed with an anxiety disorder at some point, meaning that it's no longer debilitating, right, meaning that it's no longer preventing you from living a reasonably good life, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have an anxious temperament, right? So what I mean by that is that like if let's say you stop using those tools, if you don't have the support network that you feel like you need, your anxiety, you're just going to relapse, right? You're just going to have an anxiety disorder again. It's sort of like somebody being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, being on medication, no longer meeting the criteria for it, right? Because like once you're on medication, your behavioral symptoms don't match the description of bipolar disorder. Therefore, you don't have it technically, right? It's not like active. So, but it's still obviously latent, and it's the same thing with anxiety disorders. So I think a lot of times people they kind of might look out into the world and they might think to themselves, well, I see all of these other people and I seem to be really anxious, right? These other people seem to be managing their lives really well, right? So the thing is, you never know how many people actually have diagnosable anxiety disorders or have had them, right? You don't know how many people are actually like with it, let's say, would have been diagnosed with well, okay, this is I don't want to make this too complicated, but let's say technically if you don't meet the criteria for an anxiety disorder and you're still like you're managing it through medication, you still technically do meet the criteria because under the insurance, you have to, in order to keep giving medication, you have to bill them, right? So let's say for the sake of the way the mental health for understanding the way the mental health system works, even if you don't have the criteria for an anxiety disorder, you technically even if you don't meet the criteria in the present, you technically would still have the anxiety disorder under medical terms because you're getting medicated, you're probably seeing a therapist, right? So what I'm saying is a lot of times people go out into the world and they're thinking, well, it's just me, right? Other people aren't, they don't struggle with these same things. And it's like, no, man, a lot of times people manage them. It doesn't mean that they don't have these diagnosable disorders. It just means that you don't know about them because they're probably seeing a therapist, maybe medication management, right? Some combination of the two. And so the idea here is that, like, I think a lot of it's not just me who thinks, it's not my idea, but a lot of times people who have anxiety disorders, they find themselves in these predicaments where they think, well, here I am, I'm like the hermit, I'm super shy, I can't grow up or whatever it is, right? But then here's like the rest of the world, and they seem to have their shit together, even though maybe they do, right? So it's not that you're wrong per se, but the thing is they've had the support and they've had let's say they've been taught the skills that either you've been taught and stopped using, or you haven't been taught, or you just don't have the support system that you may feel like you need. Because maybe, look, for some people, even the skills of like cognitive therapy, unfortunately, are not enough without a support system, right? So it's complicated in that sense. So, but my point is that there are a lot of people who are struggling with these things and we just don't hear about them because, I mean, they're managing them well. But to your point, right, is that, yeah, that's the best that we can do. So with the person who has an anxious temperament, not talking about just somebody who lost their job and who has an unstable, unpredictable future, who's diagnosed with unspecified anxiety disorder, the person who has like this characterological long-term chronic anxiety, yeah, the best that like I can do is manage my anxiety. I'm never going to find myself being a person who's like really stoic, and not Massimo's version of it, obviously. I mean, like the stiff upper lip Spock version, where I'm just this pure, rational, unemotional person, or mostly that. I'm always going to be an anxious person. I could just manage it better.
Well, so I have a little story.
Shoot.
Back in the day, this was early 20s, so college. Something happened to me. It was the strangest thing ever.
Hmm.
I would get on the train, and people would sit opposite me,
Mhm.
or if I'm standing, whatever, and I couldn't look somebody in the eyes.
Yeah.
Not just that, that sounds normal. Let me take this to the other
But
level.
it's New York. You're not supposed to. Yeah, technically.
I suppose.
Yeah.
I would twitch. Like I couldn't. I'm doing it right now for the camera. Like I couldn't like look at somebody. I felt a literal crazy tension in my eye,
Yeah.
where I couldn't like look in the direction of someone. I had to look away.
Right.
But as I was getting into materials, like the things that we discuss on the show,
Mhm.
for example, like again, being present, flow state, such and such.
Right.
I was bothered by the fact that I intellectually was understanding what was what was written in these books, and that I did apply them to some extent in my life. But then when I got onto the train, I couldn't. I would just twitch, and I couldn't look at somebody,
Right.
and it bothered me that I couldn't just look around and have a non-physiological sort of response.
Right.
I wanted to get to a point where I could be comfortable turning my head around to the left, to the right, wherever I want to look.
Mhm.
And of my own volition, either I'm choosing to look at somebody or I'm choosing not to, but I don't want to have some weird impulse reaction where I'm triggered and I can't look at someone. It bothered me so much that I wasn't in control there. Right. And because it bothered me so much, that actually acted as leverage for me to keep sort of pummeling myself, or putting it into my head different resources, whether it be a podcast, self-help seminar type stuff, video lectures, Alan Watts, Eckhart Tolle, like whoever, all these people. I would constantly be putting these kinds of influences into me, so this way I could that saying where you're the combo of the five closest influences or people to you.
Right.
So I try to hack that.
Mhm.
And just be like, okay, well, let's say I'm not talking to anybody, or I don't have these five influences, or the five people who are closest to me, they're not the best five people in actuality, in reality.
Mhm.
I thought, if I constantly put good information in me, or what I thought was good information,
Right.
That would act as one of those or more of those influences.
Mhm.
And that would help to structure my default personality, so to speak. And it actually worked to some extent.
Mhm.
It really did. It was up like a 0.1% change every day.
Okay.
But again, winner effect. I was like, okay, all right, let's stack this. Let's see what happens in a year from now, and all that.
Mhm.
There's another saying, right? Sometimes it's not you. Sometimes you're surrounded by assholes, right?
Yes.
Have you heard that before?
Of course.
I think that's true. And simultaneously, what could be true is it could be you also.
Well, you're the one who's maintaining those relationships, so it is you partially.
So how, for example, if you were getting negative feedback from the people around you,
Right.
depending on you, I was thinking about this recently. Depending on you, your current temperament and all that, you may look at it as if you're being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at those sayings like get the assholes out of your life and all of that, right? And you may take that and then get these people who are giving you that negative feedback and you're taking to be assholes out of your life.
Right.
Now, it could be effective, right? You no longer have that feedback of you being an asshole, and you now have the mental resources or space to sort of restructure yourself. That's fair. And I think that's true in a lot of cases. I also thought about this, and I realized that sometimes it could be your own rationalizations that could be turning these people who are just acting as mirrors or feedback mechanisms, or they echo back to you your behavior in a way.
Right.
Like, you ever talk to the same person who used to have like a bad view of you once upon a time, and you talk to them now and you're more adjusted and it's a normal interaction?
So actually, no, most of the people I did know were assholes. So it's like they didn't criticize you because you were hurtful. They criticized you to put you down.
Have you ever talked to someone who previously had the asshole perspective of you, but it's not somebody you cut out, and then you talk to them again, and for some reason it was you had zero bad interaction, or some less instance of a bad interaction than you would have before because of like how you changed or something?
Nothing comes to mind. Interesting.
Fair enough. I have a like a working theory with that where it's like sometimes I realize that maybe like for example, okay, so I think of I love my parents, by the way, let me preface this.
Mhm.
But when I was not behaving so well in my life, when my shit wasn't together,
Right.
um, they would give me like negative feedback, right? And that's normal. Actually, now that I'm explaining this in hindsight, that sounds like a completely normal thing. Anyone wants to do like, yeah, of course. If you're acting like an asshole or you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, your parents are going to reflect that to you.
Right.
But when I was hearing that stuff about the 5 influences and like you get the assholes out of your life and all of that, um, that was such confusing information at the time because I was younger, right? You need to be able to make certain distinctions, there's nuance to it, right? And then I think I did that with other people like who didn't give me the good feedback, like new people too.
Mhm.
And on one level it made sense. Again, like I said, there's pros and cons to it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't have any feedback, so because of that, I was able to work things around myself. I had the space to do that. It's like I took a time of isolation, right? That the whole being inside thing, right?
Right.
And there's a value to that too. But at the same time, it's like, oh, if when I talk to the same people later, it's a completely different experience of them.
Mhm.
It's so weird. It's bizarrely weird. So why did I bring that up? I don't know, because I don't know. That's a great answer. I'm just kidding.
You could just say, you know what? Why did I bring that up? I don't know. It's unconscious.
No. But actually, why I brought that up is because anyone who's listening to this, and especially anyone who's younger who's listening to this, because like I have to like keep in mind that if somebody our age is listening to it, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, this I know. Thank you for reminding me.
Right.
Somebody might take, like, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I was talking to them about what we talk about on the show, and they're like, yeah, like being a lot of things that are talked about in psychology, philosophy, or self-help sort of podcasts.
Yes.
There are things that like are obvious, but what I like about it is that it reminds you to think in a certain frame of mind, because you get stuck in the automaticity of things, right? That's what they said. But then at the same time, I said this next part where it's like, well, imagine my experience when I was younger.
Wait, can I ask, was this like meant to be a criticism, or was this just this person like sharing his perspective or hers?
Oh yeah, it was a regular perspective.
Yeah, just like all.
Yeah, no criticism.
Yeah, okay.
No. By the way, that's interesting that you brought that up. Depending what frame of mind I was in, I could have taken that as a criticism, and then that conversation could have gone a different direction.
Yeah.
But because I took it a certain way, it went down a normal direction. That's a different conversation. Right. But it's kind of like when somebody makes a joke, a roast joke. Let's say you take it negatively. That whole conversation, the direction it could have gone if you took it as a joke, as opposed to you taking it seriously. You could get into a fight. You could get into whatever, or you guys are joking, you move on and it's the next topic or something like that. But anyway, what I had said next was, when I was younger, a lot of these ideas I was hearing for the first time.
Right.
And it was important for me to, there are a lot of distinctions I hadn't made. So like, for example, there's certain things that we talk about here that I would say not to take with a grain of salt, but in a sense, it's like, see how it applies to your life, but then use your own common sense and then that's also, that could have its own, there are a lot of issues. There could be a lot of issues, but I would say this, take what we say with a grain of salt, and then also apply your own common sense and try to look for the nuance and any counter ideas to anything that we say, and then try to integrate those as best as possible. Because sometimes, like, again, like that advice of getting the assholes out of your life, what if your perception is perceiving them as assholes.
Right.
And then you just took your life in a strange direction, you
Right.
know? Although what I noticed again is a lot of these things have a way of not automatically working out. What's a good way to put this? Whatever decision you make, you adjust to that decision. And so you start going down that path and you rationalize in favor of that path.
Right.
So you could end up making that quote, objectively quote unquote wrong decision, but then still end up finding value from it and moving forward anyway. But
yeah, and by the way, I actually like that people think that like what we present this common knowledge or whatever. So what's interesting about that is two things. So number one, that means our information is accessible and it's coherent. That means people understand what they're saying, or what we're saying, I'm sorry. And then the second thing is it resonates with them, right? It's something that they're like, oh shit, like I feel that this is true. So cool. To me, that those are two wins.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, look, imagine somebody is like a 30-something-year-old listening to our podcast. They'll be like, oh yeah, they're talking about being present to the moment. Yeah, I learned about that concept before, but then maybe because they heard it again, all of a sudden they're like, yeah, it kind of brought my head back to that sort of thinking. Right. As opposed to, oh, actually I have been sort of in my thoughts lately. I have been sort of attached.
And I'm going to actually, so I hope this is a little bit of a mind-blowing piece of information for our audience, but I'm going to just add on to that perspective. So here's what I think happens, right? So in my cognitive framework. So what we're doing is actually a little bit new. So not new in the sense of we're presenting new ideas. I think that the ideas are old, obviously, but hopefully what we're doing is by reinforcing them, right? And by saying like, here's like why we believe what we believe, right? Here's sort of the evidence for it as we understand it. What we're doing is, let's say if a person has these dichotomous beliefs, right? So on the one hand, they're like, okay, I know I need to be kind of more focused on the present. And, I know I need to like, I don't know, I know that life is, let's say, short, and I know that these moments are all I have, right? And maybe on the other end, the idea is like, well, I also really care about success, and I care about the future, and I care about being famous, whatever it is this person's looking for, success, right? What they could do is after listening to our show, it kind of tilts them a little bit closer to that belief, right? So it's not as simple as like, I know these ideas, therefore I'm going to enact them. It's more like, okay, I know these ideas, right? And I have these beliefs, but these beliefs aren't as strong as maybe those other beliefs. So even though I knew this, right, I wasn't practicing it because maybe some part of me thought this was bullshit, right? So after I heard it again, hopefully from these guys, right, maybe now I'm like tilted a little bit now closer to these beliefs. So maybe the scale is a little bit more balanced. So again, if like, let's say one belief is, okay, let's say I know I need to be more present, and then the other belief, and this is obviously simple. So, and then the other belief is something like, well, you know what? No, I need to constantly like beat myself up and focus on the future because success is the most important thing in the world to me, or maybe even the world in general. The idea there is that like after listening to the show, hopefully they're like, oh shit, yeah, you know what? I haven't thought about that too deeply, right? Maybe now that I'm like sitting down and listening to these guys talk, hopefully I think about it a little more. And I'm like, you know what? I still want to focus the majority of my time on success and on professional achievement. But you know what? I'm going to spend a little bit more time with my friends and family. Great. I think that's a fucking victory. Even if it's like, their life is more balanced by like 2% more. Great. I don't care. We're like a fucking podcast. If a podcast could do that, I'm like, that's a victory.
So yeah, 100%. I'm definitely with you there. If it could inch somebody towards a better belief set, again, because this is an influence for them, and it's probably a more positive one as opposed to like negative feedback and such and such.
And you know what the thing is, like, have you ever had this experience where like you don't take something like as seriously initially, like when you hear it, as you would maybe after hearing it a second or third time?
That's true. Yeah. Because then you're like, oh, this is a thing. Like, oh, being present is a thing. Oh, nuanced thinking. Oh, more than one thought simultaneously. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald has a quote where it's like the true sign of intelligence is the ability to hold two or more conflicting thoughts in your head at the same time.
Right.
And like that, then you hear a quote like that, and you're like, "Oh, okay, somebody famous. This is quoted. This is a thing. Actually, it's not just like all in black or white on certain ideas." Because, well, there's a lot of things I want to say actually right now. But one quick thing from what I want to say before: if somebody is younger, right, and they hear advice like be present to the moment, that could potentially be incredibly life-changing, especially if they're somebody who is ruminates and thinks so much and is neurotic and there's a lot of stuff going on in their head, and then they hear about being present and they look up how to be present to the moment.
Mhm.
Incredibly valuable.
Right.
But imagine somebody younger who hears that advice and then goes all in on being present, right?
Right. Mhm.
And that could be good still, because maybe they accidentally make a distinction between being present to the moment and still simultaneously planning for the future,
Mhm.
right? But that's something that's important. um that's why I feel like we have a tremendous responsibility to not just like teach people these things that we talk about, but at the same time just encourage, mainly, that it's not that like you should be learning from us.
Mhm.
It's sort of like we're relating what what we
Mhm.
learned, right?
Right.
So, but I think it's to encourage critical thinking, because uh, the idea of balance, like reconciling the balance between being present to the moment and planning for the future,
Right.
that's an important distinction to make. I could imagine, and I have to imagine, that somebody could go all in on being present and then think that there's no point to planning for the future. And
Right.
somebody could go all in on planning for the future
Mhm.
and forget about being present, and they'll
Mhm.
never be happy, because I'll only be happy when I'll,
Right.
you know. Um, so yeah, it's incredibly important. What was that last thing that you were talking about? I remember now. I wanted to add on to it.
Oh, so in terms of like having people, so reinforcing beliefs and kind of shifting their behaviors a little bit, right? Because they're taking these beliefs like, or let's say they're okay. Just to make this more concrete, right? So let's say the belief is like, oh, like I know I need to critically think. Like I've already learned that, right? I know the importance of nuance. Like, oh, don't just jump to conclusions, right? How many times people say that and really do believe it to some extent, where they're like, yes, I know this is true, but do I actually do it? Do I act in a way that indicates I believe this? A lot of times, no, right? So my thinking was that if you're reinforcing that belief, maybe they take it a little bit more seriously when they hear it from us, hopefully, and it changes their behavior by a little bit, right? So where they're like, okay, yeah, I should be more cognizant, of my let's say, of my jumping to conclusions of whether or not I'm really taking arguments seriously, or whether like I'm just kind of like fortifying my initial beliefs when I talk to people, right? So my thinking is essentially that when you're talking about what we do, right? Yes, we're talking about beliefs that most people know, that it's common sense, but when they say common sense isn't so common, it's not that they mean people don't necessarily know. It just means that people, my interpretation. So it just means that people don't enact on their sort of, or enact their knowledge, right? They don't act on their sort of common sense beliefs. That's, I think, problematic. So on the one hand, you have somebody who's like, yeah, duh, I know I shouldn't jump to conclusions. Or they might even delude themselves and say, no, I never jump to conclusions. I always critically analyze every argument that I see. But when you look at their behavior, it's kind of otherwise, right? And hopefully, maybe our show, hopefully, allows them to say to themselves, you know what? I have to be honest with myself, right? Have I been acting on these beliefs, or is it for the most part that I'm acting on these other sort of prior beliefs, right? The fact that, fuck other arguments, or I'm always right, or whatever it is, right? So it's like, yeah, hopefully the idea is like we're reinforcing maybe not better beliefs, but we're reinforcing better behavior, right? We're sort of, as you said, we're reminding people, like, and by reminding them, the idea is that hopefully the next time they think about, these ideas, they take them more seriously because they remember learning about them probably when they were kids. They remember reading about them in the book, and then, oh, hey, I even remember hearing about this in a podcast.
Yeah. And so you remember earlier when you were saying like somebody who's anxious, they might be looking at other people,
Right.
and then they look fine, and
Yeah.
they can't possibly be experiencing what I'm experiencing.
Right.
Um, the truth is, if we were truly considering what those other people are feeling, like truly getting into what we think is going on in their world,
Right.
and empathizing, I think that anxiety would go down,
Right.
because truly thinking about what another person is experiencing is, that's another, it's a level beyond being in that self-centered sort of state of mind. I mean,
Mm.
in fact, depending who you ask, this is going to be a little controversial, but depending on who you ask, you might say that anxiety is like a modern day luxury,
Mm.
in a sense. And I can make an argument for it, right? Like back in the day, if you're struggling for survival, you could die any day, or food is like constantly like a priority, or you don't know how you're going to get your meal the next day, or you have to hunt, or something like that,
Right.
right? These things about thinking,
Hmm.
or uh, being overly analytical about your life, right?
Hmm.
They What they do is, I don't know, no, you don't have time to think of that stuff in those kinds of situations. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, you would still be scared, still be anxious and all of that,
Right.
but we have time these days. Like, things
Hmm.
are actually nicer
Right.
than they were. So it's like a new challenge that we're presented with. I'm not
Hmm.
saying that we shouldn't be anxious or whatever, because oh, these people back in the day, they probably didn't have time to think about these things, right?
Hmm.
But I think it's important to think about things like that. It kind of puts things into perspective. You're like,
Hmm.
it starts to make you a little more grateful about life. Like, really imagine um, you're in danger of somebody trying to steal your resources
Hmm.
and kill you or something.
Right.
Uh, I mean, I understand that that's not whoever's listening, or in our case, it's not our case, right?
Hmm.
And it's hard, you think relative to your own situation, and then you have sort of like what's good and then what's bad relative to you,
Hmm.
right? That's why somebody who's rich, for example, can still, and then has a lot of resources, can still find a way to um, not feel great about life, because uh, again, it boils down to identity and
Right.
rationalization, and anything that exists outside of your identity is uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And so it's the same mechanism playing in all of these people, whether you're in a objectively good situation or a bad one.
Right.
um, but yeah, again, thinking that it could be so much worse, I feel like helps me to lessen these kinds of thoughts. It's
Hmm.
like one little tool. It's like I combine a whole bunch of different things. Um, One is, if I notice I'm tense, okay, yeah, maybe I'll relax. Maybe I'll breathe a certain way.
Hmm.
Maybe also I'll say to myself, oh, the other person is probably feeling the same things that I'm feeling,
Right.
or thinks about these things from time to time, and it's not like just central to me,
Hmm.
right? Uh, I may remember that uh, thinking of the future or rationalizing is an abstraction of the real reality, and
Hmm.
I should be present to the moment.
Right.
Um, you may also know that just through just logically parsing out what it is that you think is going to happen with your anxiety,
Right.
how, if you really wrote it out and try to predict what's going to happen, you know that if you really thought about it logically, it could be a number of things that can happen based on the minutia of the situation.
Yeah.
Like, things can go radically different ways, so you could even logically disperse your anxiety.
Yeah.
um I
Ideally,
don't know,
right?
what do you
No, ideally, yeah. So, like, ideally, you think things through, obviously, and you mitigate it and you manage it. But again, going back to like these conflicted beliefs, right? The idea there is like that core belief, or those core beliefs are never just going to go away. I know I've said this a million times, kind of on the show, right? They don't just go away, right? So it's like they might kind of subside, or like you might be able to subdue them for the moment, or at least you might be able to like act despite them, right? But they don't just go away. But like long term speaking, right, the best that I think a lot of us can do is manage it. So I mean, that's kind of it, right? The idea is the core beliefs don't just necessarily go away, and they're gonna kind of be with you for some time. So Alan, last thing before we wrap.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
having so much fun. Okay,
I
so
hear you. I hear you.
what do you think about this idea? This is like a working idea that I've had for a while,
Sure.
but I don't know if this exists in cognitive behavioral therapy or
Mhm.
psychology. You ever? I've had this idea of okay. There have been times when I've overthought to
Mhm.
such a degree, like a point of extremity,
Mhm.
where, in a sense, my mind stopped or
Mhm.
broke. I don't know how to explain it. This is like a working thing I have,
Mhm.
but I took it to such an extreme
Mhm.
that the whatever internal feedback was happening. So imagine like, again, this is a working theory, an infinite feedback loop
Right.
of just overthinking in your head.
Right.
But you took it to its extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, okay, you can't do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of anything like that? Is that
Well, you're talking about like what? Like, so the pattern is ruminations?
Sure, but then taken to such an extreme level that all of a sudden you become tired of it. I don't know how to explain it to you. It's like,
Is it okay? So you're like taking your thoughts and you're like visualizing them as being more catastrophic than they were before, and then you just get tired of thinking about it, or is that wrong?
It's kind of like instead of trying. Okay, so you know how the natural instinct is to, you want to stop that unpleasant feeling from overthinking, but you'll automatically do it. Like if somebody is caught in that loop,
Right.
they will be automatically overthinking even if they want to stop. But then I one time tried an experiment where I said, you know what? I'm not going to try to stop this and resist it. I'm going to let this keep going. And then I did it to a level where I took it to an extreme, which is maybe I'm not articulating this well, but what happened is it kind of broke. Like, how do I put this? Like, I stopped thinking.
No, so yeah, by the way, in psychoanalysis, this is just called working through. Like you're constantly talking about the problem over and over and over again. I guess even maybe thinking about it over and over again, that you just get bored with it. This is a version of working through, right? So one version is obviously resolve the problem in some practical way, but then the other version is you start like, you keep just ruminating about it and talking about it. And then you're like, yo, I'm done. I just don't care anymore. You sort of take the fangs out of it. So. All right, man.
Oh, wait a second. What? No. Now I remember. Okay. Sorry. Remember the movie Revolver?
Yes.
So I forgot what the quote is. I wish I had it. It's fine. Like, engage the end, like they were talking about the ego. They're like, right. Engage the enemy, induce head pain. Shit, I can't remember. Oh well, to be continued. To be continued.
All right, that's a good endpoint.
Good endpoint. Yeah. So everybody, thank you so much for watching. You could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter, where Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe. Hit the bell. Yep.
See you next time.
Yeah. See you next time. Thanks so much for watching.